this particular narrated PowerPoint is going to be about public opinion polling or public opinion surveys. And it's probably the longest narrated PowerPoint of the semester. And the reason for that is that it's a really important topic. It's not just important for you to know for the class, but this is one of the few topics we're going to talk about that I can assure you you will need in the rest of your life. And I mean, there are lots of things we mention in here that are useful to know, that get you thinking, that work on sort of analytical views. But as far as things that you will find useful in your life as a citizen of a democracy, knowing how public opinion polling works and knowing how to interpret these polls is something that will actually be really good for you to have. There are many, many times that we would like to know what the public thinks. There's a new policy that's being debated in government about Social Security or a war, and we want to know, okay, well, what does the public think about this? When there's an election going on, we want to know, okay, well, who does the public favor? Who are they going to vote for? Who's ahead in this race? And in order to do that, we have to ask them. We have to do a poll, as it's called, or a survey, as you've probably more likely to have heard it in the past. The problem is that we can't ask everyone. The population of interest, the population that we want to know opinions from, is usually really, really large. The United States of America has over 300 million people, so we can't exactly ask all 300 million people what they think about an issue. Even if your population is smaller, let's say that there's some issue that comes up in Charlotte County, and you want to ask people of Charlotte County, Florida, what they think, there's still hundreds of thousands of people, and you can't possibly ask them all. So instead, what you need to do is, you need to take a sample. You need to ask some smaller number of them, and if you set up your sample the right way, that will allow you to make inferences or to make conclusions about the entire population. Now, what surprises people is just how small that sample size can be, but still give you an accurate view of the public. So it turns out that no matter how big your population is, whether you're talking about wanting to know the views of students at State College of Florida or the views of everyone living in America, you really only need a sample size of 1,200 to 1,500 people. I know that some of you, that is blowing your mind right now. You are like, there is no way that is right. If I want to know what 300 million people think, I need to ask a lot more than 1,500 folks. But it turns out it's true. We can't really go into why it's true. It has to do with sort of the law of large numbers, the central limit theorem, all sorts of statistical stuff. But if you're fascinated by that and you're like, I don't believe that, I want to know more, take a statistics class, and then you will know more. And it'll be a very useful skill for you to have in life. So that's right, political science advice, take more math. And math is everywhere. But the thing is, any 12 to 1,500 people won't do. You need to make sure you have a random sample. Okay, that is the key. If you don't have a random sample, then there's a very good chance that you're not going to get an accurate estimate of public opinion. So here's my favorite example of what can go wrong if you don't have a random sample. So before we had all of these polls that we have today, back in the 1930s, there was really one major group that did polls. It was this literary magazine called, what was it? It was like Literary Digest. It was a precursor to Reader's Digest that we have today, but it was a different group. And every presidential election, what they would do is they would do a poll. But they wouldn't randomly pick people. What they would do is they would go and get the lists of all the people who had registered automobiles in the country, and then they would call them up, or they would mail them, I think, like envelopes asking them who they were going to vote for, and then they could send them back. And so they did this in 1920, and they correctly predicted the winner of the election, and they were pretty close. Did it in 24, did it in 28, did it in 32. And they kept getting it right, and people were like, wow, these people really know what the heck they're doing. And then in 1936, they did this poll, and they found conclusively that the election was going to be a landslide victory for President Alf Landon. Now, I know some of you don't really know your American history that well, but presumably you would know if we had a president named Alf, right? I mean, Alf is the name of, an alien from an 80s TV show. It's not the name of any of our presidents. Because what actually happened in that election was it was a landslide for Franklin Roosevelt, for FDR. They were completely off. They were off by like 20 points. And it was pretty much the end of their magazine. And the reason this happened was because they weren't taking a random sample of Americans. They were asking people who had registered automobiles. 1936 was in the middle of the Great Depression. The only people who had registered automobiles at the time were really, really wealthy. And they were likely to vote for Alf Landon, who was the Republican candidate, which was the party of the wealthy at the time. So if you don't do a random sample, you can get really biased results. So these days, the most likely way of getting a random sample is to use what's called random digit dialing. They have computers that will just randomly pick numbers. And so you need to make sure that groups are getting random samples. You often see polls that are reported that don't have random samples, right? If they do internet surveys and they leave it up to you whether you want to vote. Okay, if you have call-in votes, right? American Idol, not a random sample because you have to call in to vote. You have to choose to participate. Now, even with a random sample, you're still not going to get it perfectly right. Okay, it's not possible. So you have 300 million people and you ask 1,500 of them, even if it's a random sample, you're not going to know exactly what the views of the public are. Instead, we get what's called a sampling error, and this is a crucial concept for you to understand. Whenever you see a poll result, if you open up a newspaper, pretty much any given day, you'll see the result of some poll. And what it'll say is, at the bottom, it'll say plus or minus 3%, or plus or minus 4%. That is what we call the margin of error. That is our acknowledgement that we have not asked everyone in the country, and so therefore we expect our view is right, but it's within plus or minus 3%. And as you might imagine, the larger the sample, the smaller the margin of error. If you were to ask everyone in the country except for one person, your margin of error would be really, really small, because you'd know everyone's views except for one person. If, on the other hand, you were only to go poll 5 people, your margin of error would be plus or minus, probably close to 100%, because you really don't know. You're just guessing. You've asked 5 people out of 300 million. So the margin of error is important, because if the poll shows that views are really close, are within the margin of error, then that means that essentially the poll just doesn't have enough information to tell you. They need to go ask more people if they want to be certain. If you look at an election poll and it shows that 48% of people are going to vote for Obama and 47% are going to vote for McCain, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, that's essentially saying that the race is too close to be called at this time, that we don't have enough information from this poll to decide who's ahead. There's also another form of sampling error that comes from uncertainty. Now, this is something we're not really going to get into, but there's always that chance, and the way we set it up in statistics is it's usually like a 1 in 20 chance that a poll is just completely wrong. Right? You might just happen to randomly pick 1,500 people that are just not even remotely representative of the rest of the country. And it happens. It doesn't happen often, but it's possible. So it's just something else to keep in mind. Even the best designed poll with a perfectly selected random sample can still be off. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen.